Everything is personal right here. Everything is personal right here.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another episode of Everything is Personal. And I want to welcome my guest, Seth Lorinczi, to the show. Thanks for being on, Seth.
Oh man, what a treat.
I'm so excited. Like we were just talking before that because there's so many similarities that we have, plus parallels, and you did so many different things that intersect with my life as well. So I'm gonna make this, my ADD brain is kicking in big time. I was gonna try to make it linear, but it's like all over the place. So I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try to do this in a way. All right, I'm gonna ask you a question to kick this off. Tell me about the hardcore and punk scene in the 80s and 90s in DC. What was that like?
So, I mean, here's the thing. Like, people always ask me, they ask about the punk scene, or they just ask about growing up in DC because it's such a singular place. And look, here's the thing. I can't compare it with anything because I didn't grow up anywhere else, you know? I will say this, like, as I grew older and I began to, I was in touring bands for a long time. And as I began to leave DC, I realized, oh yeah, there is something really special here. And what I would say is that the DC scene was, God, it was almost, I hate saying this, but it was almost more of a hippie scene than a punk scene. And by that, what I mean is people were really organized around political action.
Mhm.
They were really organized around mutual support. It was not a violent scene, not when I was growing up, a few years before, for sure. But it was really welcoming. And my memory of going to shows is that it's not, 200 people in leather jackets and studs. It's weirdos. It's white kids. It's black kids. And DC is a really international city too. So it was not the kind of stereotype, violent punk, let's break everything kind of place. It was a creative alternative to a pretty conservative city, but B, also, look, this is the Reagan era. It
Yeah.
really feels like, whoa, we're living under the empire right now. And so I think DC was really unusual. And it took me a while to understand that. But, those relationships, I mean, I'm sure you have the same experience. Those relationships persist. Like, a lot of conversations I have are with people from that time and place. And we're just sort of, kind of an incredible gift to have literally, 35-year conversations with people. They just continue. They get to evolve over time. That stuff is not over at all.
So did your involvement in music, your personal involvement in music, did it start prior to you going to seeing a show or getting like seeing a music? Or were you already playing music?
No, I was a piano kid when I was young. I was going to say I was forced into playing piano, but that's not quite true. Like, I loved music, and I think, I grew up in a pretty, like anyone who came to punk had some break in their lives, right? Like, no one who had an easy stereotypical childhood comes to punk, right? Like, it takes a contract being broken for you to look outside and say, hey, I want an alternative because I think what I'm being shown isn't all there is, if that makes sense. All that to say, so I was a piano kid, and piano gave me comfort in a household in which there was little comfort. So I was already a musician. And then when I discovered that there was edgier music beyond what I was hearing on the radio, for instance, that was just a key in a lock. And yeah, that was just like falling through one of those trap doors. And like, oh, there's this whole world here that I would never have known about.
So as you're playing piano and I'm not sure if you had your sights on like I'm going to be a professional musician, like we'll get to that as well. But as you're playing and then you started participating in the scene, how did that influence sort of your approach to life and creativity? Did it change in any way your trajectory prior to where you were going?
Yeah, it really did. And this is something, we'll get into the book, I know, but like this is one of those themes that again, it takes time to understand. And what falling into the scene was for me was initiation. And initiation is something that we've really lost as a culture. I happen to be Jewish, and of course, the rite of initiation is bar mitzvah slash bat mitzvah. That was not something I ever experienced. My family was incredibly Judaism avoidant. So that was, you may relate to this too. I see you smiling. Uh, that would, so that was not really a pathway that was open to me. When I fell into the punk scene and I started meeting adults, remember, I'm like, 14, 15, 16 at this point. I was young. When I start meeting adults who've devoted their lives to their creativity, that really had a huge impact on me. And initiation, I believe, is about, well, first of all, it's about separating yourself from your family and your tribe and saying, yes, this is where I come from, like this is my lineage, but I'm stepping out as an individual. I'm an adult now. And there's something really important and ritualistic and symbolic about that. The problem for me was that because I was so alienated from my family, once I had that initiation, I never really went back. Like I didn't return to my family, if that makes sense, for a long, long time. And that was, I think, not ideal. I think the point of initiation is that you're individuating yourself, but then you come back, right? That's the idea. Like you do your, like in Aboriginal culture, you do the walkabout.
Yeah.
You go out in the wilderness and you test yourself, and then you come back and you say, this is what I learned and this is who I am. I didn't come back to my family, and that to me is painful. I wish that had gone a little differently.
When you're in this scene, let me see if I can try to figure out how to ask this question correctly. You already mentioned activism, rebellion. It starts building as part of that scene. There's a political. Not only are you in DC, and maybe that's part of it because there is a political kind of connotation to that. The music itself and where it came from, and then and it moves into hardcore, and there's a lot of rebellion, and there's a lot of angst. Is there sort of a correlation between that and trauma healing and self-empowerment? Like,
Yeah.
is there a bridge to that you may not be aware of consciously, but is it building subconsciously to that?
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really distinctive thing about DC. These days the word emo is a musical genre, and I honestly don't understand what emo is.
I don't even understand musical genres, to be honest with you. I used to be
Yeah.
a music buyer for Tower Records, and I think we're partly that and radio are guilty in putting people in boxes.
Yeah.
You're listening to Radio One in England; they play everything, and we have to have these specific genres, which I found odd.
Yeah, and people who are older than me talk about listening to radio in the 60s, and you would hear The Doors followed by Frank Sinatra.
Right.
Right, followed by folk music. Like it was, it was not nearly as compartmentalized as it is now. The thing about DC is I really came up after the hardcore era. The hardcore era, let's call it that, like 1980 or so to 83 or 4, ish, like, genres blend. But there was something unique about the music that was coming from DC. And there was a hardcore band called The Faith. The singer was Alec Mackay, who's Ian Mackay's younger brother.
Yeah.
And I think they in particular were really looking at emotional issues. Like, why do I feel like I don't belong to what's around me? And what am I going to do about it? It wasn't just, fuck Reagan, always a popular sentiment, but it was looking at something kind of internal. And that was a really big deal. And the bands that came after them, I'm thinking of Rites of Spring, which a lot of people call the first emo band. Again, if that's a real genre, I have no idea. But it's really searching emotive music. And I never saw Rites of Spring. I was a little young for that. But a lot of people talk about going to those shows, and people are in tears. Like that's the mood in the room. Like there's something really cathartic, and there's something about, again, no one came to punk without some contract being broken. But right here tonight at this show in this little sweaty, fucked up room, we're gonna let that feeling be okay just
Yeah.
for a few hours. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. I can relate to this because I always thought about, I came from an abusive household, and my room was sort of my sanctuary. And I remember the music that I listened to was sad music. And I don't even know how, like, there's something about music that is emotional with somebody else's pain that connects to me. Like I remember really, really listening and liking Alice in Chains. And if you really listen to lyrics and a band that Lane Staley had, Mad Season, I mean, he's telling you what kind of pain he's in and through the addiction, all that stuff. But man, it's just so beautiful, and there's a connection to that energy, and it connects you instead of pop music. Right? Nothing against any music, but it doesn't great. You can dance to it, but it doesn't have that connection, that visceral
Yeah.
connection that you're talking about as well.
So I sidebar, I have to say this. If you watch the video for what was their biggest hit? Wood?
Yeah, probably
Yeah,
would.
okay. Yeah. So if you watch the video, gets to the first chorus, which I think is the band playing, and then after that there's street scenes in Seattle. Watch that because you'll see me.
You're in it. That's
I
great.
I was visiting Seattle, and I guess they were just out on the street shooting B-roll or whatever.
Yeah.
And this in the days before cell phones, and I wasn't watching TV or cable or anything like that, but I started getting all these phone calls like, "Hey, nice job, man!" Like, what are you talking about? I had
What did I
literally
do?
no idea. Anyway,
Oh,
that's me.
that's hilarious. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. There's such a connection. I didn't know this that you were gonna. I just brought up Alice in Chains
Yeah,
as a
sure.
side. So, uh, let's go to your origin story and kind of connect the dots there. So, you grew up in DC, uh, as we mentioned, correct? And tell me a little bit about your family dynamic. Were your parents together? Do you have siblings?
Right. So I was born in Milwaukee actually, but
Okay.
we moved to DC when I was 3.
Okay.
My dad was a lawyer, and my mother, I think, really pushed him to kind of up his game. He was Hungarian. He spoke at least 5 or 6 languages, and basically she was like, you can do better. Like let's up our game here. Uh, a few years after we moved to DC, actually a year and a half after we moved to DC, she was literally bitten by the wrong mosquito. We were on a family vacation. She contracted encephalitis and she died in the span of, she was sick for like a week, if that. Uh, and so everything changed very rapidly. I was 4.5 when that happened. I have a younger sister. She was 2. And what I the way I like to kind of digest that is it wasn't so much that trauma happened. I mean, of course it is, but it's what happened afterwards that really affected me. And what happened was that with my mother out of the picture, the people who were left, my father and my grandmother, were Holocaust survivors. And they were people who had never metabolized their trauma. There was not a structure for that, or they didn't have the emotional architecture for whatever reasons. And what I like to say is, uh, what do survivors do? They survive. Like, we get through this. And so there was no one who could put that trauma into context for me and help me understand that yes, this awful, earth-shattering thing has happened, but we're going to be okay. Like, we're still here and we're still a family. And again, it's a rationalization, but that's how I like to frame it. Like, it wasn't that she died, it was that because of the family structure, that was it was just never really digested, if that makes sense. So after that, I think, like, looking back at my story, it's like, oh yeah, of course he's gonna find punk at some point. You know what I mean? It's like he has to.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you talk about sort of omissions in your family story, and then
Mhm.
you also talk about we'll get into generational trauma, but how did you uncover some of these sort of missing elements in the story of your own family history?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it took decades, honestly. I mean, here's the thing. I find punk, whatever, a few years after that. I start listening to like edgy music when I'm like 12 or whatever. And that works for a while. Like, I found a community, I found lifelong friends, and I found something to orient towards. But that wasn't enough. I think, based on whatever it is, my family history, intergenerational trauma, my personality, however you want to frame it, I just kind of put my head down and went into hiding. I was someone who I would say was just kind of trying to get through life, to be honest. And it wasn't until I was in my 40s that everything fell apart enough for me to realize, oh, I need to understand what's going on here, because my life is not working anymore.
When
And
you say fell
yeah,
apart, I just want to kind of unpack that a little bit because I was trying to figure out how the trauma manifested itself in you without
yeah.
you knowing that it was trauma, and then also your relationship to your father or whoever else is left in your life. How did that sort of manifest itself?
Again, like, I can only sort of pick up the pieces in hindsight.
Sure.
Now I have a far deeper understanding. But my take was that I was not living my life. I was not really engaging with the world. I was really closed emotionally, creatively. Uh, and I was kind of hiding from my life. I mean, honestly, like, the feeling I had was that I was sort of watching my life go by from behind thick glass. Um, and I didn't understand the reasons why that might be until things fell apart enough, that glass, the container had to break. I had to reach a crisis. And thankfully, I do not suffer from addiction, but that's a part of the addiction narrative, right? Like, things have to hit rock bottom until you understand, oh, something needs to change. It was once that did, and I'm sure we'll get into the story of how that glass broke and what happened afterwards. It was only then that I realized, oh, I think the experiences of the people who raised me might be, I like to say, pulling the wires and pulleys. And what I mean by that is, the listeners can't see it, but I'm moving my arm right now. And it was just that sense of, like, who's doing that? Like, whose lines am I reading? Why am I going through the world with this face on? I didn't choose this. And maybe there's something deeper behind the scenes. And that's what the book is really about in the last, what, 8 years of my life, is understanding. I think that's the simplest way I can explain ancestral trauma. It's this notion that you have this imprint, and you're running this sort of shadow program, and it may not even be yours.
What was your relationship like with your father growing up? As you're getting older, was he supportive of the music that you actually did? You were out there as a musician, and also the music you listened to.
No. No, he was a classical music person himself. And when I was doing my piano, everything was good. And then when I quit piano and started getting into rock, suddenly things weren't so good anymore. He uh I understand now that when I was a teenager and rebelling against the family system, he deeply rejected me. And I understand why. He was keeping so much under wraps. He didn't have the emotional architecture to sort of go into the hard places with me. But honestly, it was after I'd moved out. I moved out when I was 17. I was 18 or so, maybe even 19. And I came back to him and I said, "Hey, look, you need to know me as I am. I'm your son. I this music, what I'm devoted to may not make sense to you, but I'm still your son." And I'm just thankful I had the wherewithal, some moment of clarity that I realized I had to make that first step. And that's just how it had to go down.
Did your relationship change and improve once sort of put a
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
100%. 100%. Yeah, in fact, I think before the sort of psychedelic chapter of my life, which started about 8 years ago, I'd say the most meaningful experience was a few years after I reconnected with my father. He got sick. He got a terminal cancer diagnosis. And I spent the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 months of his life caring for him. I stopped everything I was doing and I went to live with him. And that was the most profound and meaningful chapter of my life up to that point. Absolutely. I loved and revered my father. I wish we could have gone deeper in some levels, but by the time he died, there was nothing left to fix. You know what I mean? It's like, we're good. We're okay.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, sometimes it takes that type of event to really start building that connection. I had a moment in therapy where my therapist asked my parents to come in. My dad told a story that I didn't remember because I was like 3 years old, and he was making a man out of me. And at that moment, I was just like, I had a profound experience, and it wasn't psychedelic, which I will get into as
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
which helped. But it was a moment of like, wait a second, you were trying to take away my power. I understood where he was coming from, but the emotion of crying and all that stuff, that's a human emotion. But you thought that was a that was weakness.
Yeah.
So you equated that in some way that because I'm not crying as I'm being hit, I'm a man. That's the kind of man that you're making it me. And like, no, you don't understand. Like my throughout my life, I felt guilty about any emotion that I would have. So you have to, push those down until they're going to come out one way or another. And they came out with me in a lot of anger and violence and all this other stuff that, supported me throughout my teenage and maybe early 20s. So I completely understand, that type of dynamic. And then, so I want to get into your book. I'm gonna make sure I get the name right. So, Death Trip, Post-Holocaust Psychedelic Memoir. Well, so I want to ask you about the connection between the Holocaust and your family dynamic. Was there a moment where all the things sort of clicked into place, like an interconnection for you from all those things that you started uncovering about your family history, about all this stuff? Was there a moment it's like, okay, now it all kind of came to fruition?
Yeah. Yeah. So what happened is, for me, I said, things had to fall apart for me. And again, that was about 8 years ago. My marriage fell apart. And we had a daughter who was about 9 or 10 at that point. But I feel really distant from my family. I'm not emotionally engaged. I am putting expectations. I mean, you just named, that struck me, that vignette about your dad trying to impose his cultural values on you. I was doing the same thing to my daughter. I was not physically abusive, but I was I was not connecting with her emotionally. I had expectations. I was unconsciously training her in the ways I'd been trained, to behave a certain way. So things are falling apart. It's not working out. And as my wife and I are headed towards divorce, I had a sudden insight, I guess. Before my father died, I had browbeaten him into writing down his recollections of growing up in Hungary in the 30s. He wasn't even sick at that point, but something told me this would be really useful. Like we would want to see this at some point. So when things are falling apart in my own life, something told me to go find those papers. It's only about 20 pages or so, typewritten pages. But I realized I hadn't read them in 20 years, and 20 years since he died, that here was a map of my family. And I'm looking at all these names, many of people who I'd actually known, my grandparents, my aunt. And I realized there was a backstory here, and it had literally been decades since I'd even really thought about them. So things are falling apart in real time. Here's this document pointing me back in time and also pointing towards some really dark stuff. My family, my immediate family, my dad, my aunt, and my grandparents, they survived the Holocaust and they survived the Battle of Budapest, which is not much known in the West, but was comparable in some ways to Stalingrad. I mean, not in terms of lives lost, but Budapest was destroyed. Tens of thousands of people were killed, and it was one of the last big battles of the Second World War before the Soviets hit Germany. So I'm realizing, oh, they lived through some really, really jaw-droppingly awful things. And right now, my life is falling apart. I don't know why. And those themes of hiding, like hiding myself emotionally, spending all my days in my basement recording studio, kind of waiting for something to happen, I'm realizing that there may be a connection there. And that all came to fruition, as you put it, when my wife and I went to see a therapist so that we could divorce more consciously. We had a couple of sessions that were more or less ordinary, like just how we're going to go about this. And the therapist, after the second session, said, how would you like to try one under MDMA? And I was, I'd say surprised would be a mild way of putting it. I didn't know this was a service she offered. And it certainly wasn't legal. She was risking her license. But having no other recourse, we said, okay, why not? And literally that night is when everything started to change. And as you said a minute ago, like when did those threads come together? That was it. I realized, oh, what happened thousands of miles away and decades ago might be having some effect on my life right now, and I need to find out why.
So when you did that MDMA experience, was it an IV? Was it a troche kind of not that it matters, just
No, that's ketamine.
uh-huh.
Ketamine is IV or troche. No,
Mhm.
MDMA was in powder form in a capsule.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
like I mean, I've done plenty of ecstasy way back in the day. So yeah,
yeah,
I used to press it in the tablets and put it in, but I just didn't know what the medicinal way that they're implementing that.
yeah. So you know the organization MAPS?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So their MDMA protocol, which the therapist follows, is 3 sessions in more or less 3 to 6 months, basically. And they suggest a 125 milligram dose, and a quote unquote recreational dose is about 75 milligrams. So this is a little bit more, and it's really, no one's dance. Well, okay, there is dancing, but uh, it's really to take you over that threshold and into some deeper, emotive, entheogenic spaces.
So as you're doing your MDMA experience, the first thing, what were some of the revelations that you experienced through that psychedelic therapy?
You know, there was definitely some buried memories that came up, and I think the most impactful one is I realized I re-inhabited the I think the very last time I saw my mother
Mm.
as she was leaving for the hospital that night when I'm 4.5, and there was just something merciful about that memory because that whole time is so blocked off. I don't know. Do you have kids?
Yeah, I have my daughter's just about 20, goes to Berkeley. So yeah.
Okay. Wow, yeah.
And I same kind of thing, by the way. I got divorced 11 years ago. My daughter was somewhere around 8, so very, very
Yeah,
similar.
yeah, yeah. Well, the reason I ask that is because, as you know, when kids hit about 4 or 5 or so, the memory reorganizes. There's
Yeah.
basically sort of like wiping out everything that happened so that new structures can be built. So all my memories of my mother are pretty much gone. But getting to revisit that memory and just sort of inhabiting the the sadness of it, but in a safe way. I mean, that's why MDMA is so useful for PTSD, right? Like you can revisit traumatic memories and metabolize them. You can digest them.
Yeah.
You know. So that was part of it. But the other thing that's as significant is my wife and I recognized in that first session, and there were many more to come, uh, that the ways that we've been relating to each other and relating to ourselves, they were all stories. I mean, there was nothing inherently true about them, except that we'd chosen to believe them. And this is a big spoiler for the book, but we're still married. I mean, that very first night,
I was just about to ask you because you keep referring to my wife,
yeah,
and I refer to
yeah,
my ex-wife. So
yes,
I'm really glad you brought that up because that was my question.
yeah. No, I mean, like, I'm not exaggerating when I say that MDMA saved my marriage,
Yeah.
and probably my life. But in that first session, I recognized that there was buried stuff about my mother, about my family. And again, my dad's memoirs are kind of like feeding the fire in the background. But just as importantly, I realized that the way I was relating to the people closest to me, my wife and my daughter, it was just story. Like there was nothing saying you have to present this way and you have to, you have to project on them in this way that you are. And just for a few hours, kind of floating in that space, freed from those stories, I recognized that they weren't true. And, once you see something like that, you can't unsee it.
It's such a profound thing because I believe I believe that we tell ourselves stories that we believe to be true, but it's only our perspective of what the truth is. And we're so isolated from other people's perspective that we just take that and we put on. I had the same. I mean, even today, I had a thing where I reacted with my girlfriend, and I was telling her, and I apologize after the fact, but she triggered something in me, and I knew it was nothing to do with her. It was just her pattern of questioning. She triggered in me something that I was just like, I responded in a way that I normally wouldn't respond, and I thought about it. I'm like, that's not my typical responses. Where the hell did that come from?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it is this whole pattern, but I think pattern recognition is really important. Like recognize it first.
So I'm so glad you said that phrase, pattern recognition, because I think that is one of the deep and impactful things about psychedelics in particular. It's so hard to actually pull over from your life and have perspective on it. You can say like, I'm going to go on a vacation or I'm going to, change my habits for a little bit, but it's really hard to get outside your head and get outside those patterns. One of the most important things I believe psychedelics do, and this is why animals such as coyotes and wolves and foxes and reindeers and caribou, they intentionally eat psilocybin. To me, that's pattern recognition, right? That's how animals function in the wild. This is where herds go. This is where prey go. This is where predation happens. It's recognizing those patterns because they keep them alive. And I think that's one of the gifts of psychedelics, understanding that like, oh, no, we're just kind of trapped in this matrix that we've constructed about who we are and how we move through the world. And we're just playing out a pattern. And that means we don't need to. We don't have to.
Yeah. That makes
you know.
total sense. And so in your journey as you did your MDMA experience, and I want to just preface this because you mentioned recreational, and I've done plenty, but this back in the 90s, it's same thing with ketamine, but it's a huge difference when you're doing it for therapeutic purposes. There's somebody who facilitates, but also reintegrates after the journey. And I think it's so important for people to understand, like, MDMA, I'm dancing the club in New York, and it's wonderful, and I can feel people's breath, and it feels good on my skin, like all that
Yep.
stuff. All right, but what does that have to, that has nothing to do. I don't know what to make of that, but when you have a facilitator and you reintegrate, it's a completely different process. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And I think you also had an ayahuasca journey as well, correct?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'll say this: we're incredibly lucky. And I mean, look, you talked about coincidence earlier, and just the strange role that it plays. Once my wife and I fell into what I call medicine world, like underground ayahuasca circles and secret MDMA therapy, coincidence dissolved. Like there's no such thing. Like everything is connected, and those weird, surprising things that happen. Again, I call it pattern recognition. Like, oh, that's just how life works. You can call it weird or trippy or coincidence, or it's just like, yeah, guess what? It's always there. And I think we do a lot of work to tune that stuff out. I'll say this: we found that therapist kind of by accident, and it just so happened she was skilled in MDMA therapy. She also had really good experience and really good ethical boundaries. And basically, what she said was, look, there's any number of medicines you can work with: MDMA, ketamine, ayahuasca, 5-MeO. The list goes on. It doesn't really matter. I mean, there's some functional differences, but the work is the integration. The work is, how do we take those experiences and then weave those into our daily lives in a meaningful way. And here's something about MDMA. I didn't know this when I went in. I intentionally went in naive. Like I'm gonna let what happens happen. I'm not gonna prejudice myself. But what I learned later is that it opens what's called a critical window. Basically, there's this span of time, few weeks, in which it is a real kind of neural reset. And it's this opportunity to relearn some of the lessons that we learn as young kids, like what are the values of bonding to people around you, right? Like how does that support us, and how does that make us safer and more held and more happy? And after years and years of marriage in which I was increasingly kind of walled off and self-protected, having that critical window open in this very loving and wide open, like, wow, what the hell just happened to us space, was a really huge deal. And I would say that's all due to good integration practices. On the flip side, unfortunately, if you're in that critical window, you just had your first MDMA experience, and you're put back into a traumatic environment, you're going to relearn those lessons exactly as you would have. Like, wall yourself off, protect yourself, lead with anger, projection, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I was thinking we just experienced as we're recording this, it was a 1 year anniversary of October 7th in Israel. So I want to talk about psychedelics and healing trauma, but also triggering, because I think about it this way. First, there was a music festival, Nova Music Festival. I've been to some music festivals. I am 100% positive, I know this for a fact, psychedelics were used. And you just said a really interesting thing, because as you're having a psychedelic experience and you are having an event that's, I mean, trauma, there's people being killed, massacred in front of you, that affects you in enormous ways. In addition to that, you just have the 1 year anniversary, and we're still getting the protests and the colleges and New York and all that other stuff, with people supporting the people that actually did the massacring. It's interesting to me how psychedelics were the trigger. Can they be used as a healing source for the trauma that was caused during October 7th, and then following up on that now?
If you go to the publication Reality Sandwich,
No.
no, okay, they're a long-running psychedelics journal, basically.
Okay.
They're on the web. But I edited an article on Nova survivors and their experience, and it's up there right now. There's a large-scale study being done at the University of Haifa right now on Nova survivors, and it's basically trying to tabulate what happened or what happens when people experience trauma on psychedelics.
Yeah.
And are those experiences helping them metabolize the experience? Are they worsening the experience? And they're using, things like neural imaging, and they're trying to quantify this in a meaningful way. I mean, it's such a hugely awful and messy story in so many ways. And I think the ways in which, there's so many political angles to this. I'll say this. The idea of anyone of any nationality being assaulted under that state is horrifying. And I hope that if any good comes from it, it's that we have a deeper understanding of how we function so that it improves care for people in the future. Because that was arguably the first act of psychedelic warfare. Attacking a rave in which 3,500 kids or so are tripping.
Yeah, exactly that. And we've had warfare under the influence of drugs. I mean, you go back to, even the Vikings and the Nazis given, methamphetamines and all that stuff. But this is different because you're going to a festival to exactly at the moment, and people were peaking at that moment because it's the sunrise. And now you have, I'm just because, I've had some very intense psychedelic journeys. I never talk about a bad trip. I don't believe anything is good or bad. It's just intense. And, I think one of my most intense was with 5-MeO DMT, which was extremely intense. Can't say that it's good or bad. It was just intense, and everything is a learning experience. But I can't imagine what those kids had to go through in experiencing that, and then continuing to experience that in the quote unquote real world as no sympathy, no empathy, none of that stuff went away. And you sort of, wait a second, you deserve that kind of thing. It's just a very, very odd time that we're living in with that kind of experience.
So when I started doing book events, and the book came out late May, so I've been doing events ever since. And a lot of places, the organizers ask, are you going to talk about Gaza? Because it's just too radioactive.
Yeah.
And what I say is this, and I say this to the audiences as well. I wrote a book about ancestral trauma and how it, I believe, was guiding me to act against my own interests and against those who loved me the most. Right? It was unconscious, and it was warping my worldview. Everything that's happening right now in the Middle East, and arguably any human war, is a result of ancestral trauma. It's a result of undigested, the feelings that we've pushed aside because they're too painful, they're too complicated, or they're too, I'm thinking of your experience with your dad, they're not manly, right? They're these experiences of grief and sadness that we're not supposed to express. And as people wiser than me say, grief that is not expressed becomes grievance. It turns against the people around you, right?
It's very profound.
And you know, that's my take on what's happening now. And God knows where it's going to end. It's so disheartening.
So I want to get back to this intergenerational trauma. I read a study years ago that talked about, you're passing on your genes to your, to your kids, which, okay, you have your genetic predispositions. They always said that your epigenetic expression is not passed on. But there was a study that came out somewhere in out of Europe that said that they studied families of Holocaust survivors, and they
Yep.
can show that there is epigenetic expression, like methyl group expression, that is passed on from generation to generation. My family's Holocaust survivors. I'm an immigrant. I was born in Lithuania.
Yeah.
Came over when I was 6 years old or so. My grandfather had a stroke in the very first year that we came here. He was in the Holocaust, and there's all this stuff that goes on, and even my dad having his nature. I understand now that it comes from his trauma, because he was born 45, 46 at the end of the war, no food, like, and it's this repetition. So at some point I had to raise my hand and say, I'm not gonna I'm not gonna carry that on to my daughter. I'm gonna try as hard as I can to be a different father than my dad was to me. And I'm not saying good or bad, just different, because it didn't really connect. That wasn't a way that I would raise my daughter. So I had the opportunity to do something different. Not perfect. Sure, I messed up. My she's gonna be on the couch
Yeah.
with the shrink talking about something, but I want to minimize that as much as possible. So I'm just curious, in your writing, in your own journey, how do you go back and how do you try to fix that generation? How do you break this cycle?
Yeah. Yeah. Here's the thing. It's not hardwired, meaning, as you correctly said, epigenetics is not, we're not given these genes because of the trauma. They express differently because of the trauma. And that's not something we have conscious control over, but in a way, there's a gift in that. As in, yeah, it's something that was changed, and if something was changed in that coding, it means it can be changed on some level by our conscious behavior. And I think that's our only hope, frankly. It's understanding that that these are destructive patterns and they're not hardwired. There's no law that says we have to relate to our children and our partners and our friends and our community in this one way. Everything that we're doing is it's a program. It's coding on some level. And of course, there's a challenge in that too, because it'd be nice to imagine that there was some pill, some therapy, some surgery that would change that gene expression. There's not, at least not yet. And for me, there's my wife, who I say without hesitation, is a far wiser person than I am. But she talks about the metaphor of a reel of film. Like, what after that MDMA experience, we understood we were sort of acting out these roles and that we didn't have to anymore. And one night I remember she said, it's like I'm watching a reel of film. Like, we'll get into an argument, say, or some kind of conflict. I'm watching a reel of film. And if I just take a breath and apply a little consciousness to it, it slows the reel down. And I understand this is not me. I'm watching the film is telling me how to react to you, but it's not actually me. And if I get good enough at it and I actually slow the reel down even further, it's like, what'd she say? There's like a gremlin between the cells of film. And that is what is like, that's our job.
Yeah.
To understand that there's these other shadow programs running, and not to try to exile them or shame them, but to embrace them, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's how we work through trauma. We don't we don't push it down further. You know that.
Yeah. No, it's so profound. And I think what people, I'm from Philadelphia. Like I grew up in Philadelphia. I
Mhm.
live in Los Angeles. So one of the things, like going back to Philadelphia and talking to friends of mine that, LA is very accepting. I mean, shadow and all that other stuff. We talk
Right,
about
right.
it. It's no, but I think people get intimidated and start to, oh, you guys are LA or California, microdosing, and they start talking about, they get intimidated by the terminology that's being used. And I think how you frame that, and also how you frame this in your book, your analogy that you just said about a movie or film. I
Yeah.
think that becomes much more acceptable and something people can actually touch and feel and relate to a little bit more than talking about, oh, I had a microdosing experience and my shadow self. And by the way, I had an ego death. Well, what do you mean? Well, I took I
Yeah.
took a 5-MeO and I thought I died.
And I disappeared. Yeah.
And I don't know what happened. And the guy that was facilitating, he's like, and I was explaining, I was trying to hold on because I was falling, and then
Yep.
I died. And he's like, "Why are you trying to hold on?" And I was like, "Wait a second, what?"
Yeah.
It was so profound in a way. I never thought about it, but I think relating it in a way that people can say, yes, how does it work? So you relate to somebody on the scientific level. I can explain to you they have
Right. Right.
neuroplasticity. I can explain to you, but somebody won't. But if you can create analogies for people that in day-to-day lives, that's a great way for people to start relating to it.
So that was on, like, you've pinpointed my goal for the book,
Yeah.
right? Like when I was writing this book, which is, starting in 2017 or so, it was a long process. There's some contemporary writing about psychedelics. There's Michael Pollan's book,
Yeah.
How to Change Your Mind, and there's a number of others. All great books, great stuff. I wanted my book to be something different. I wanted it to be a narrative. It's not a scientific work, it's not academic at all, but it's just one person's story of how this might look. It's kind of like a case study. And my goal was to make this something that you'd want to read. Like it's a narrative, like you want to know how the story ends. I think that's really, really important because what I find is that because it's not a scientific book at all, I find it gives people permission to share their stories and share where they're coming from and what they think they might have experienced and what their shadow is. And it's funny, I actually just did a little reel about this earlier today. I get these notes from from people I've known all my life. I never knew their backstory, and a lot of them from people I've never met. And they're just like, well, actually, my family was saved by a Jewish family, or my dad was forced to serve in the German army and we could never talk about it. Like there's so much shame around that. The sharing a personal story rather than a scientific one gives people permission because it's just a human story. That's it. Like it's simple, really.
And it's a lot more relatable that way because people
Yeah.
think about it as an elitist kind of thing. And I know this because I have a company that does genetics. I do genetic
Right.
testing and analysis and all that stuff. And when I'm talking to academics, I'm talking to healthcare professionals, I have to keep it sciencey, but you have to be able to take all that and make it relatable to Bob from Iowa. We always talk about it. It's like, am I getting too sciencey? I just want to make sure that the average person can relate to the information. And I think you do a great job in communicating that in your writing. I have a question that just popped in my head. How does music, being a musician, how does that influence your writing, or does it at all?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's a real pleasure. Like people have told me, oh, I've read, like reading the book, I can tell you're a musician.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if I could put it into words, but there is a musicality. Reading a book out loud is really different from writing it or reading it on the page. And speaking out loud, I mean, look, you know how music works. You know what makes you move, and you know what has an impact in your heart, in your head, in your limbs. I don't know if I could say it any clearer than that. Like, I put the words down, and they're meant to convey a movement and an emotion. Um,
It's
yeah,
that. It's that evoking emotion, very similar to a songwriter writing a song, and then the music, the lyrics and the music complements, and sometimes it doesn't, but it all goes together. And I think there's a rhythm to the
yeah, it's
writing
all, yeah,
style that is different from an academic sort of writing a book where it's just a textbook type of way. So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, here's the thing, like, academic works are not, and I don't read academic works for a reason. They're, they're not meant to move you emotionally.
right.
They're meant for the head. And I very much wanted this book to move people because I wanted to resolve. I wanted people to feel my story so that they could, it would loosen something in them. And it's honestly, it's the greatest trip and the greatest honor to me that it's doing so, that
Yeah.
it gives permission to people, because we all have stories, you know.
Speaking of that, did you ever question how vulnerable you should be while you're writing your book? Like, am I gonna take everything outside myself and put this, or maybe there's some things that I don't really want to share?
No, I here's the thing, because my life, I talked about rock bottom earlier.
Yeah.
I knew that this was it. Like, I was in my mid 40s when I started this book, and I felt like I had fucked up my entire life. I really did. And for better or worse, that drove me. Like, I'm going to share everything. Uh, why not go to the bottom of the ocean? You know what I mean? Uh, and and that comes through on the page, And I'll say this: look, as a writer, there's a fine line between sharing something in the hopes that it resonates and then demanding a specific response from someone. That's a fine line, and I definitely do not want to demand a specific emotional response from people, right? Like, how you take this is up to you. But yeah, I'm going to share everything, and it is a gritty, personal, wrenching book.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of humor in there, and at the end of the day, I want people to read it and feel again that there's a generous heart behind it. After so many years spent behind that thick glass, what I really want is connection, and
Yeah.
this book is my way of asking for it.
Love that. I wanted to ask you a question that's sort of off topic in a second, but maybe what is your involvement or was your involvement with Dr. John Sarno? If people are looking you up and all this stuff, they're like, oh, John Sarno, what does that have to do with it?
Well, here's the funny thing. No connection with Sarno whatsoever. However, so a guy is a filmmaker named Michael Galinsky, and he made a documentary called All the Rage, Saved by Sarno. It's a beautiful film. And Galinsky and I were kind of in the same scene. Like, he didn't grow up in DC, but like, I know there was like shows that, we were in the same room together. We just didn't know it. And somehow we found each other. And I was moved by his film, and he was really moved by my book. And we quickly realized, oh, we're having the same conversation. Like, we're talking about the same thing, but we're just coming at it from different angles. And what's really funny is that I started mentioning his film at book events. I mean, the book events are wild because it's, yeah, I'm sharing my book. I want you to think about it and hopefully buy a copy. That'd be great. But it's really like a conversation with the entire room, you know? And so I started throwing out, oh, by the way, if you're thinking about trauma and how it impacts us and how it affects not just our emotions, but our physical bodies, you should watch this film. And every single time I do, people's hands shoot up like, oh, Saved by Sarno.
Yeah.
He healed my back. And it's kind of amazing. And I'm actually heading to the East Coast, I think in February, and I'm going to try to do some events with Michael Galinsky where we're screening the film or parts of the film and then talking about it, because again, we're talking about the exact same thing, just from totally different, vectors.
Yeah, I mean, from personal experience, it would be nice. And I'm not putting myself into your mix in your group, but it would be interesting to see what genetic predisposition somebody has,
Yeah.
how that manifests itself, because I'm a big believer in stress and trauma manifesting itself in different ways physically, as Sarno and Michael have mentioned in the movie, and then what do you do about that? So what do you do about that? There's a lot of different ways that Dr. Sarno talks about in healing back pain and the mind-body connection. But if you can add in this psychedelic experience and start working on the trauma that may not be your stress in the moment, but could have been
Yes.
intergenerational trauma, now you're able to see, okay, let me really truly heal for generations to come as well.
So here's the thing. I'm so glad you said that, because I had a conversation with a therapist recently, and she's not psychedelic, but she said something that everyone, many people in the psychedelic space say, which is that when you do this work and you actually dig into it, you're not just healing yourself. I mean, that's wonderful, but it is generational, and you're moving back in time and you're moving forward in time. And I see that in my kid. This work it's really deep and profound. It's a true, I'll say this, like it's not the only way to get to this result. There's meditation, there's prayer, there's exercise, there's mindfulness, there's all these things. Psychedelics are so exciting because it's just so fast and it's just so experiential. When you're in the midst of a psychedelic experience, there's no resisting it. There's no saying like, well, yeah, I'm not sure about that part. You're in it. And again, once you see these things, you can't unsee them. I'm not saying that everyone who takes psychedelics will magically be cured and everything will be great again, but they have such immediate, desperately needed potential. I mean, look around us at how lost so many of us feel and how disconnected so many of us feel from those around us. I have a lot of doubts about the psychedelic industry. Look, like you, I grew up in punk, and I have a healthy mistrust of institutions, and I see a lot that's pretty sketchy about the psychedelic industry, I'll be honest. I also see immense potential, and I have my own experience to look back at. It deeply changed my life. And I want everyone who has that kind of curiosity to get to experience that too.
All right, I have some questions, music related questions that I ask
Yeah.
all my guests. So this may be fun. I don't know. Do you remember, and if so, what was your very first concert that you attended?
So I have a cousin who lived in Boston, and when I was like a young, unruly teen, I was sent up to Boston to hang out with her. Like maybe she can kind of like set him straight. She did not set him straight. She had really poor boundaries and, got me high when I was like 13. Like, yeah, no, not good, not good caretaking. However, she knew I was really into edgy music. So the first show I went to was, oh boy, I want to be kind saying this, but I look back at it, it's like, yeah, they were like a very, I don't know, kind of by the numbers new wave band. They were called the Logistics. No one's ever heard of them. Lowgis. Yeah. Anyway, but that kind of planted the seed. I'm like 13. Like here's edgy music happening on the stage in front of me. And stuff began to crack open. And once I got back to DC and I realized, oh, like punk is not just happening in New York and Boston and London. It's happening right here. Like there's people my age doing this. And so I sort of gradually, I was a weird socially anxious kid. But once I discovered like this stuff is happening and nothing was as exciting as music, I began to, make my way into the scene and find, punk shows then.
Got it. What was the last concert that you attended?
Oh, God.
I ask musicians this, and I had the guy from the Scorpions, and he's like, "I don't go to concerts. What do you mean?
Yeah, right.
I played in front of a million people. I don't
Yeah,
go to
I don't
any."
need that. Oh, that's funny. Who was it?
It's a bass player, Ralph Rickerman, who was
Uh-huh.
there for like 14 years. He was their bass player.
Wow. Um, that's such a good question. It may not be technically correct, but I have old friends in a band called Unwound who
Hmm.
were from Olympia, and then Sarah the drummer lived in Portland for years. Unwound is playing shows again. Actually, wait a second, they're in Santa Ana tonight. They must be in LA like tomorrow or something. Anyway, Unwound were an amazing band, had a huge effect on me personally, and they sort of reanimated after a long break, and it's still just jaw-dropping, beautiful music.
All right, so this is another music question. For the next year, you can only listen to 5 albums.
Ah,
Now, you don't have to name the actual album. You can just say, The Unwound or whatever it is. And I realize that I'm capturing a moment in time because somebody asked me that question,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
was like, well, I got my 2 or 3 sort of go to, but the other ones interchange. So I'm capturing a moment in time.
Oh God. Oh, that's so hard. Especially like I don't, unfortunately, I don't have time for like large scale psychedelic experiences in my life as much as I would like. But every time I do, Funhouse by the Stooges has to be in the mix because there is just something so unhinged and like let it all out, shamanic, debauched craziness. That's still got to be one of my favorite rock records of all time. It's funny, I was talking about Boston a minute ago. There was a Boston band called Mission of Burma who were kind of like post-punk, arty, post-hardcore band. And for whatever reason, when I was young, they caught me at the right moment, and there was something mysterious and kind of dark and edgy, but also hopeful about them. So they got to be in the mix. Joy Division, I mean, that anyone looking at me would be like, oh yeah, of course that guy likes Joy Division. Oh God. But it's so hard. There's so many records. So, okay, I'll say this. The first band, again, I'm like 12, 13 or so, and I loved some of the bands I would hear on like rock radio, like the old Who and the Kinks and like old British Invasion stuff really spoke to me. But the first band when I was a teenager that really spoke to me like on a heart level, I'm like, oh, they see what I'm seeing, was the Jam, the
Mhm.
British band. And I still have like there's like a deep soul connection. Like that music is really meaningful to me to this day. I think I got 4 bands.
Yeah, you need one more.
Oh God. Okay, well, I don't revisit it that often, but I mentioned Rites of Spring earlier.
Yes.
And if you care at all about DC Punk, they're this kind of hinge point, like this one moment in time. They only played like a dozen shows, like they were around for an instant. But their album, the Rites of Spring album, is a deeply, deeply special record. It's so emotive, but it doesn't demand a specific reaction. It's just it gave permission for others. And the music is just so fierce and crazed sounding. There's just nothing else like it.
I got to tell you that I think yours is the most unique list that I've gotten
Yeah.
so far in about 200 episodes. So just
Okay.
that's pretty good.
I'll take that.
All right, so final bonus question. Please describe what your room looked like growing up.
Oh my God. Wow. Thank you, because the picture is totally unfolding in my mind right now. Oh, the house I grew up in is a big character in my book because there was something very quiet and contained and fortress-like about it. which I realized was not an accident. That was my dad's unexpressed trauma manifesting in, here's the kind of place we need to live that feels protected. So I felt really enfolded in that house. My room was on the corner of the second floor. There was a navy blue tile carpet and very mod kind of like 60s furniture, like modular furniture, a blown glass lamp with a yellow lens, and a loft bed. And man, especially in that traumatic, after my mom died and everything kind of fell apart, that room was really a safe place for me. And I appreciate you kind of bringing me back to that.
Were there any posters or anything on the wall, any art, anything was sort of specific to you at that time that you can recall?
Yeah, it's funny. Not yet, because I wasn't yet like a rock kid.
Yeah.
Later, the photo of Pete Townsend from the Maximum R&B poster that came with Live at Leeds.
Yeah.
That made it up onto my 12-year-old wall.
Yeah.
Before this, no, it was actually pretty bare. And there was just a kind of like weird stillness and safety to it. So yeah.
Cool. Seth, where can people find you, engage with you, buy your book, anything else you want to share?
Well, Len, the book naturally is available wherever fine books are sold. However, that said, the best place to get it is actually just direct from the publisher. It's called Spiral Path Collective, and that's the URL. Otherwise, if you're bold enough to try and spell my name, you can find me at thethlorinczi.com. I also have a Substack where actually I write about music and punk quite a bit. It's not just psychedelics. So on Substack, you can search me there. But yeah, thethlorinczi.com or spiralpathcollective.com are the best places to find the book.
Cool. Any social? You're active anywhere else in social, or Substack is usually the place that people should connect?
I'm on Instagram for sure, and I find that useful and connective. But more and more, like Substack is a really lovely community. It kind of like it dispenses with the sort of like look at me of social media, and it's about writing and sharing ideas, and it's a really sweet community. So yeah, I spend more of my time there than any place else online.
And for my listeners, I want to thank you again for getting through the entire episode. If you stayed here, you must have been entertained or just like trying to find out. It reminds me of the thing. I don't know if you ever saw the Howard Stern movie. They talk about, a Howard Stern listener generally listens for about 40 minutes. And then a Howard Stern hater listens for an hour and a half. And they said, well, that doesn't make sense. Why? And I said they're curious about what he's going to say next. They're going to hate him for it. So maybe they were just curious to see what we're going to say next. But I want to thank my listeners. Thank you for all the reviews. I really appreciate it. Thank you for buying my book, which can be found on Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. And Seth, pleasure, man. I really enjoyed this conversation. I want to thank you so much for being on. Appreciate it.
Oh man, what a treat with you, Len. Truly.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Take care.
Hey everyone. Thank you for watching and listening. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button, share this episode, and hit that bell. Like, comment. I so appreciate that. And check me out on social under Len May or Len May DNA. Find out more on LinkedIn or lenmaycoaching.com. And remember, everything is personal.